All right, today is Monday, August 18th, and we have a special guest with us today. But before we get to who that is, we're talking three major topics. We're talking about a Wall Street Journal article and how measuring cybersecurity has become an issue. And the issue is, what is the best way to understand the impact of the dollars being spent? The next article we're talking about is how those measurement gaps lead to underfunding certain technologies, how businesses are struggling to keep up with the current threat landscape simply because they're not getting enough money. And the third topic is how when governments or certain sectors start threat hunting, what they find. And what they're finding is there are a number of gaps in critical infrastructure everywhere.
All right, this is episode 16 of the DTF Cyber Podcast. I'm Damien.
This is Troy.
And it's your boy, Fern. So I don't even know how to introduce this person, but we're going to give it a shot. We're going to say the one, the only, the award-winning, global, at least national, 16-year veteran, Fortune 500 CISO. The first name is Dina. The last name, Mathers. Dina, say hi.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
She's back, people. But she's back in a new capacity because today we're bringing her into the club of the Cyber Podcast.
Yeah, here's an interesting fact, right? I think the reason why I met you, Fern, is because Dina had brought your name up. She had just done your other podcast. Do you remember that, Dina?
I do.
Yeah, so there would not be a Cyber Podcast because Fern and I would have not met had Dina not mentioned your name, Fern.
Wow, thank you, Dina.
So you're the reason, Dina, that I now do this weekly, and I am stuck editing on the weekends. But you're also...
I didn't actually know that, but I'm honored.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I said I never really thought of it like that way, but I thought of it more like. But I guess that makes sense because you were at an event that Damien was hosting, and lo and behold, now Damien and I and Troy have started hosting our own events. Pretty crazy.
Love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and for the listeners out there, if you're wondering,
sure,
we're doing another event in September. I think, right?
We'll get another one going, but the one thing that Fern asked me to do was his other podcast, and I said I didn't have time to sit down for 2 to 3 hours. But what's crazy is that we do this for an hour every week now, so it actually turned out to be more time.
Yeah. He didn't have enough time for me one-on-one, but he's got enough time to do, a guest or a few people like on a podcast every week. So who's the real winner? Me.
Hey, Fern, one thing I was going to mention is that our DTF dinners have turned out to be a really great way to get people together. I don't know if you want to talk about the one we did in Scottsdale or even here in Las Vegas during Black Hat. Like, people are coming together. So I really like the theme of a DTF podcast dinner. And we're going to try to do these either quarterly, maybe even more frequently in cities near to you. So, those have turned out to be so great. Come out and hang out with the folks you hear on the podcast, but also meet security leaders in whatever city we're in. I think it came out really great.
Yeah, I could just cover it real quick and say we did an event. We had 20 seats available. Every single seat was packed. There was someone in every single seat. It was a couple weeks ago. We haven't released any information about it, but it was sponsored by an up-and-coming stealth company with some very, very interesting technology. So the way I like to see it is we're bringing you the latest every week in news, but we're also bringing you some of the latest technologies coming out of stealth. So in stealth, but looking to work with clients in the local markets. So, I guess you can't really protect against the latest threats if you're not using some of the latest tech. And maybe that's how we look at it is we're bringing you the news and the companies that are changing the way the threat landscape is evolving. So,
The funny thing though with Fern is like we talk about networking all the time, and like the best way to get into the industry or progress in the industry is to meet your peers and network, and put yourself out there in the right place in the right time. And these dinners, I've always met somebody new security leaders, new people I've not met before who are doing excellent work at whatever their company is. And so these dinners are a way also to network and meet new people in the industry.
Yeah. And you know what's even crazier about that is I've had people reach out to me that I haven't talked to in years. And they're saying, hey, man, looks like you're crushing it. I see you everywhere. I see pictures of you with a bunch of people. Like, what's going on? Like, people are asking me to have coffee dates with them now. I'm like,
Well, because now you're famous.
yeah, maybe I wouldn't say I'm famous. I'm just I'm more visible, right? But maybe that means I'm famous. Who knows? I walk around with a Sharpie now just in case anyone wants a signature, by the way. I'm just kidding. So let's get into the first topic then, right? Before it gets too late. Measuring cybersecurity. Now, this is kind of I think it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? People get in fights over this stuff. We'll just say that. Because what I've noticed with all people that I've met in security is everyone is always looking for more budget to do different things. And the other thing that I've heard from these people in security is it's really hard to convince leadership that it's worth the money. So to me, it seems there's a disconnect on how security leaders are communicating to the business, not just the risk, but the financial impact of making investments and what that impact or what that investment could lead to or prevent from happening. So this article makes it very clear that some places look at cybersecurity spend as a percentage of total revenue of the business, which might work. But I think there's a lot of nuance there because depending on the industry that you're serving, whether it's healthcare, retail, finance, it's not an easy catch-all. And I think a lot of people fall under this, well, based on how much we earn, top line revenue determines how much we spend in every department. So who wants to go first? Who wants to say what they think? And maybe what's the best way to do it? Is there a good way? I don't know. I'm asking.
Friend, the companies I've worked for in the past, I mean, everybody measures cybersecurity differently. I always love to map to a framework. I'll talk about NIST all day long, as you know, but I think that every company has this set of magical metrics that they've been looking at for years, and they want to see those numbers increase or decrease depending on what the metric is. I don't know that there's a right metric for you per se, but one of the most important things is mean time to detection of threats, mean time to remediation of those threats. And so there are some specific metrics that really matter to threat exposure. But then you have like compliance metrics, like how fast are we patching versus the vulnerabilities, and you have all these other patching, phishing. How many clicks do we get in a phishing campaign? There's a whole stack of metrics that people can choose from when they're presenting them to leadership. But what I have also found is that leadership likes consistency. So if this month I'm showing them, patching and phishing and SOC metrics, next month I don't want to come in with 10 other new metrics and educate them on something new. And so I think it's just a matter of what feels right for your culture and leadership. And then as you talk about mapping that to dollars using the FAIR model, using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, using another framework that I love, to say, here's where we have exposures and or gaps in our cybersecurity roadmap, and here's how much money it's going to cost to fill that gap versus how much money it would cost us if we have an exposure because of that gap. And if you can use that to kind of use data-driven points to show leadership that you actually need this, it's so important. But then on the flip side of that is, I get asked this question a lot, Dina, and I'm going to defer to you on this. Is like, how much is enough? We get asked all the time, well, we spend this millions of dollars on cybersecurity. How much is enough? And so how do you answer that question?
Yeah, so I think that's a bit of a difficult question to answer, but when I'm doing budgeting, say for next year, I do use the industry benchmarks as far as like the percentage of cybersecurity as a percentage of IT budget or the number of employees that I have or revenue, but I really use that more as goalposts just to get a kind of baseline understanding because it's such a wide range, especially if you're working at a Fortune 500 company with 20,000 employees. You're if you're using these benchmarks, it could be, say, your cybersecurity budget should be anywhere from, say, $5 million to $17 million. That's a huge variance. And so for me, it's more of like a litmus test. And then I say, okay, this is how much I spent last year on cybersecurity. And then, Troy, to your point, here are additional funds that I need to close some gaps using a risk-based approach. That's how I set it up for budgeting. But that's not necessarily how I get funds for different use cases. That I almost view more, and I know you mentioned consistency, but I almost view it more like a resume where there's a template and you start with why. Like, why do we actually need to make this investment? What's the business impact? Is it reducing cost? Is it improving user experience? And then using that to like articulate your business need. That seems to be effective, at least from my perspective, on getting funding. Damian, what are your...
Yeah, I think
so underrated, the business use case. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think about it in a different way. I think you're, trying to figure out how much other people are spending on cyber based off of percentage of IT and percentage of revenue and things like that are really high level. If I put it this way, right? If you have kids and your kids always say, well, my friends get X amount of candy a week. And I look at them and I say, well, I don't adhere to that standard. You shouldn't be eating any candy. Don't you already have enough candy in your candy box, right? So some of those things kind of just resonate in cybersecurity, because I don't know if you're ever going to get enough funding, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, I get it. You want to measure it according to your industry peers. But if you turn it around and look internally, because I'm highly operational, I want to be able to spend what I already have and make sure that my tools are implemented efficiently, right? We talked about this in other episodes where there are organizations that have a ton of tools and maybe only implement 20 or 30% of them. Or they'll take a new tool and only implement, the tip of the iceberg and not get everything operational or integrated. So I want to turn the conversation around a little bit and say, okay, maybe the fight is on the top end of looking for that initial budget, but once you get it, what do you do with it? Right? Is that a concern for you guys?
Yeah, and I also want to say I like to carve out some innovation dollars, right? So part of my budget, every year I earmark a certain amount, small percentage of the overall budget, but a small amount for innovation. And what I mean by that is startups. We love to lean into innovation and some of that new technology coming out where we can, do a POV or a POC with a new tool. A lot of people don't like to take chances on new companies because they're not established. They may fail in a couple of years and may get acquired. And I see all those risks, but I also see the benefits of leaning into innovation where you're solving real business problems at a fraction of the cost that this product.
Yeah, but Troy, you're going to have the same problem. I mean, even if you get a new technology, if the organization never adopts it or never operationalizes it, well, what's the benefit?
Right, exactly. And I think we talked a few weeks ago about my director of strategy and innovation. His job was to take every tool we invested in and give me an ROI metric. Are we leveraging all the tools that we've paid for with that tool? Show me where it's reducing risk. And, evaluating your tools every year, kind of like an audit of your spend to say, am I getting the value out of these tools? I know in my last couple of years in my previous company, we were looking at, reducing the number of tools, but improving the impact, and doing that through the ROI calculator was so important.
Yeah, I think you both touch on like tool rationalization, right? We're well intended. Sometimes we overinvest in technologies and then we're not using all of the functionality and capabilities. So it really is around rationalizing those investments and figuring out, does this actually make sense anymore given our current strategies or priorities, and aligning that with your renewal date. And in some cases, you might be able to rip and replace because you really didn't deploy or operationalize the tool. So yeah, I definitely think that's important. And that's, Damian, you were mentioning this. One of the ways you can get funding is being able to say, well, I'm going to replace this technology with maybe a startup or a lower cost option, or in some cases, maybe it's a higher cost. But those are a bit easier to sell because you're already kind of spending the money in your budget versus something that's net new. But I think it's important to highlight, like, hey, we saved 7 figures because we got rid of these tools that were redundant or weren't fully deployed, or operationalized.
So you don't actually have to go back and get more funding because you just found the savings. Yeah.
True. Yes, absolutely.
So that's my point, right? I think that there's one side of it where there are security leaders who are going there and saying, I never have enough money, or I need more funding, and they're trying to measure against what their peers have or what other companies in their vertical have, but it never matches up one-to-one. And so you can always turn around, look back at, okay, what do we currently have? What's in our stack? And what can I make more efficient? I'll tell you this right now. I know, Dina, you talk a lot about automation, right? I have automation within my operations as well that save us 20 FTEs a year just off of that automation. And so that's easy for me to go back and say, look, we spent X amount, but I'm saving 20X on the back end by not deploying 20 different resources to do these jobs.
So, interesting point here. While you guys are chatting, I was checking some things online. And what I find interesting is that roughly, based on Gartner's estimates, as of 2023, right? So, not old, but not brand new. 30% of a cybersecurity budget is wasted on overlap and underutilized tools. So, and whether that's something having a capability that another tool that you have, so you have a primary tool, or just say a famous company out there for security firewalls that happens to offer a service around other areas of technology because they offer platforms, and then you happen to buy a point solution that does what this other product has the capability of doing, right? But you do it because it's
what Troy calls best of breed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's best of breed. So you're looking at platform versus best of breed. And we talked about this, I believe it was last week, but because of that overlap, 30% of the budget is essentially wasted. So my question for you guys and ladies is it better to go in and ask for more money first based on the goalposts and the metrics that you have? Or should people focus on reducing the overlap, showing that savings, and then redirecting those funds within the same calendar year? Or are you aware of that and you understand where that is, so you just leverage that later with the expectation of not renewing? So if you have 3 products and one of them is an overlap, when you submit your budget, do you just leave it as is and say, well, we have to renew, with the intent of kind of transitioning those funds from that third product into a new product that maybe wasn't on the roadmap?
Well, I think you're oversimplifying it. That's the problem, right? The overlap is not 100% overlap. If it's 100% overlap, that's just a duplication in the tool. What's happening is that there's these, not full platforms, but there are now tools that are kind of creeping into other areas, creating an overlap. But what you have to do is figure out, is that the best implementation or best feature technology for your organization? So I wouldn't say, eliminate all overlap, because we're seeing an EDR company get into the SIM space. Is that the best use of your dollars to just bundle that in with the same, or do you stick with your original SIM? And then we saw Black Hat. There are new technologies coming up saying you don't need your SIM. And so it's not an easy, hey, let me eliminate all these overlaps, because they're starting to creep in. Right? We just saw a big firewall company pick up an identity company, acquire an identity company. So now what do? Right? You go to these massive platforms and implement everything they have, or do you start to look and compartmentalize each of these security towers and do best of breed?
Yeah, I think Damien brings up a good point. Not every overlap is the same, but I think it's prudent to evaluate your technology spend, especially for upcoming renewals, to determine, do you actually need this capability, or is there a tool that you can use to replace it? And then potentially reallocating those funds. But yeah, Damien, your point resonates with me, because there are a lot of platform players out there that have bolted on features just to say they have this capability. But when you look under the hood, it's not, no. it doesn't meet your requirements, right? It doesn't have the coverage that a purpose-built tool might have. So you might have to invest in that best of breed or specific tool that addresses that gap.
I think that's the argument we have with procurement, right? I'm pretty sure you face this, Dina, where procurement will say, well, why are you looking at that tool? We already have it bundled in with this package. And really, the features are just not there to protect the organization.
Yeah, I tell you, it's the same old story. I think all of us have this massive platform in our environments that offers DSPM as an example. What I would call not that great DSPM as generation 1. And then so you go out and you look for that capability, but your CFO or your procurement says, hey, we already have this. It comes as a part of this other thing. And you're like, it doesn't do what I needed to do to find and to classify and to tag the data that I need to follow. So you have to really be on your toes to point that out. And sometimes those platform players, they don't sell to the CISO, they sell to the CFO. So they bypass you trying to show the things and the money that you can save if you go with their platform. But, this is the age-old question of best in breed versus, platform. What I was going to say, Dina, is that I've never been told no when asking for budget. I don't think any board or leadership wants to say no to a cyber project and then have a breach, right? So I think the important part is if I'm doing my job as a CISO, I'm bringing data-driven points that show I'm being responsible, with the money that I've been given, and I'm replacing a tool with a new tool, or I'm reducing my cost over here so that I can offset the cost of this new thing. But I've just never had the problem about going in and asking for budget. It's more about how do I articulate that need in my own roadmap. And we talked about, metrics. I love metrics if they're the right metrics. Some people are still holding on to old metrics from 10, 20 years ago that don't really make sense anymore. And especially with the age of AI and how fast we're able to progress in the Security Operations Center and other places, I think our metrics may have to evolve with us so that we can articulate that data story a little better.
Yeah, since you brought it up, Troy, I was going to say, Dina, the AI in reporting, I think, is a really interesting topic. Have you guys started to look into AI reporting metrics? Like using AI to report for you?
Yeah, we do have bi-weekly syncs as a technology leadership team, and I have used I've fed it some data, and it has produced some operational metrics to help us articulate some of our top initiatives or projects and how we're reducing risk. And to Troy's point about, because he brought up DSPM, and that's something near and dear to my heart that we're actively working on, it's not just the cost of the technology, but I've been able to say, well, it's going to accelerate our data retention, which is actually going to drive down our cloud cost, because there's this misconception that cloud storage is cheap until you accumulate petabytes of data in the different cloud environments. So that's also an effective way to get the funding that you need. But yeah, I'd say I'm kind of in the early stages, but we have leaned very heavily on AI, obviously to triage tier 1 and tier 2 events, but just at infancy stage for using it for reporting, I'd say. And then I guess Damien or Troy, do either of you use cybersecurity risk quantification technologies, and what are your thoughts there?
Like threat modeling, or are you talking about heat maps and things like that?
Well, and I don't want to drop vendor names, but there are there are some products out there that supposedly will enumerate your, technology footprint, understand the vulnerabilities, and then within the context of your environment, in some cases, reclass risk. Like if a vulnerability is on, say, an domain controller, that might be a higher risk than just a internal server or Kubernetes cluster or what have you. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts there. And I mean, I have my own, but I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, for sure. Tools that look at what you currently have in the maturity of them, and are there any gaps based off of misconfiguration or policies that are not implemented? We're doing that, and then on the vulnerability side, the prioritization, and then also the just making sure that it is a true vulnerability and it's exploitable. There are tools that will do the automatic exploitation just to test it. And so a lot of that,
Yeah, that makes sense.
just to make sure, because sometimes the scanners pick them up and they're false positives. And so if you take the automation a step further and you actually try to, exploit it, and if you're doing it yourself, then you can validate whether it's a true vuln or not.
Yeah, and we were toying with these ideas. We were doing some proof of concepts when I left my last role as a CISO, and I think they're a great addition to your repertoire because they plug in by APIs and they can look at all your tools and not only tell you where you have this heat map for risk, but they can also tell you if you're using all the functions of your tools that you've purchased and are they configured correctly to get the maximum value for the tools that you're using. And so I think that's a great new area of the industry that I would like to explore more as a CISO. I think that'd be a great help.
Well, I have my own thoughts on it. So I do use a cyber risk quantification tool. I think it does provide some contextual prioritization because I think none of us are strapped. Well, we're strapped for resources, but we have visibility and risk all over the place, right? From all of our disparate technology investments. And sometimes it's a little challenging to prioritize your efforts. And so it's helped with prioritization or at least understanding where the top risks are. What I will say though, is these tools that say like in financial terms, what your like risk exposure is or the cost of a breach, I personally have chosen not to share those metrics with our executive team because if I can't explain how it was quantified, like I don't want to be in the hot seat with the CFO trying to defend this number. And so I think it's good, but it needs a little bit more work because there's not a lot of explainability.
Yeah, I love that. And I also get you can save 2 headcount with this tool. Like that's not what we want to hear when you walk in the door. I don't want to replace my people. And how do you have that number, off the top of your head? It's something that we need to see. We're going to upskill our people. We're going to give them something more important, different to do.
The automation piece is different because it's not like you're eliminating positions. So we'll make that clear. It's about getting more stuff done and then elevating the people that are currently in those roles. So you don't have to go and hire, somebody just clicking a button. But the one thing that I'm kind of concerned about really with those financial tools that look at how much a breach would cost or how much a certain risk would potentially impact. They're so subjective. So, and I agree with you, Dina. It's hard to go in with a number that you don't really understand. And so let's take a healthcare organization, for example. I think there's metrics that say this is what a patient record is worth, or this is the cost of a breach for every patient record that is leaked. And I don't know if those are completely accurate. It's hard to be accurate on this when it ranges from, small organizations to large organizations, and then the brand damage. It's really hard to put a number on it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So yeah, I don't present the financial impact from those technologies to the executive team because I can't explain it. But I think it's a good understanding, to prioritize risk. But
yeah, that'd be terrible if you say it's, a $10 million risk and something happens and it ends up costing 40.
Absolutely.
Or 50, right? Because that's the one, and they might overshoot, but they also might undershoot.
Absolutely.
You're not really sure because there's, it hasn't happened, right? And it's not specific to you. It's just more so based on a calculation. But that kind of leads us into topic number 2, which comes around to measuring gaps and finding out that a lot of security departments are underfunded. We're just at Black Hat, and there's a lot of talk about AI and agentic AI, right? And what that means for upskilling people, because you're now moving certain tasks into automations. And when you go to an event and you see every sponsor or every vendor talking about how you can do more with less, it just requires that you buy their stuff, right? My fear is that 1, these products aren't ready for the market just yet, but 2, that they're overpromising on what they can actually do, because there is a lot of nuance in the world of cybersecurity, and I think it might be hard for someone to just simply replace, right, a person with a tool, but it seems that there's a lot of people saying that. And I guess maybe to expand on that is if you have people looking to do these things, there might be things that are overlooked right? So if there's not a clear way to measure or understanding what you're working with today and what is missing, my fear is a lot of people will kind of lean into this do more with less mentality, find a use case for AI, and then potentially just completely overlook a small issue that they hadn't thought about before, right? So this goes back into underfunding. If people are getting less and they're choosing to try and get more through automations, how do they make sure that they don't overlook certain things?
Well, let's be clear. Yeah, let's be clear. I don't think anyone's getting less. I think it's like I don't know of any security budgets that are actually shrinking, but they may not be keeping up with the growth of the organization. So I guess in that case, yeah, it's shrinking according to the growth of the organization, but not necessarily shrinking in actual dollars. I don't know, Troy, Dina, have you ever worked at a place where your budget has actually been retracted or shrunk year over year?
I have not, no, not at all. But I do talk to mid-market, CISOs, and sometimes what you walk into as a CISO is a low budget already, and you have to go out and really fight for budget. So sometimes underfunding could just simply be that they have never aligned cybersecurity priorities with the business. And I talked to a lot of people who are walking in fresh to a new role, and they're looking at this going, how am I going to survive with this budget to do what I need to do and protect this business? Because you have people, process, and technology that you have to invest in. And, with limited budgets, you have to be very creative. And, we can do a lot with, what we have, but you can't boil the ocean. And if you walk into an underfunded organization, trying to convince leadership that they need to spend more on cyber is sometimes difficult because their entire mindset was built around that first number. And you have to explain to them very carefully and articulately with data why they need to increase it. So I can see underfunding, especially in the mid-market. But, like you said, Damien, on the Fortune 500 side, I've never heard of a peer of mine saying that their budget is decreasing, but they are asked to do more with what they do have, with automation, with AI, and to lean into innovation to solve some of those challenges.
Yeah, and on the agentic AI front, I think, Damien, you touched on this earlier. I'm not seeing it replace like my current team members, but I don't necessarily need to hire new team members because the agentic AI capability can do the work that I was going to hire, say, 2 analysts or an engineer to do. So in that case, it's not necessarily a replacement. It's more of I don't actually need to grow the team because I'm going to lean into agentic AI instead.
Right, augmentation, right? Making the team more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you were talking about underfunding, I don't know that it's exactly related, but Troy touched on this earlier. You're understanding where your gaps are. Like I use NIST cybersecurity maturity framework to measure impact of, like how mature are we in these different domains and help that, like use that information to justify budget or even communicate success. Like last quarter, I did these specific projects and it increased our maturity in, identify as an example by doing XYZ project. And that's been helpful. And I've consistently articulated that maturity journey to our board and gotten very positive feedback that way. And I've also done it at other organizations as well.
That's great, Dean. That's exactly what you should be doing. And you just touched on something with that story that resonates with me is that CISOs are now business-facing people where you have to go into the board and be able to articulate. So being a storyteller is so crucial for a CISO. Instead of being a technical person, what you just said and how articulate you were with how you use data and you matured in identify, that's exactly what they need to hear because these are business folks who are spending money. They don't understand cyber. They want you to understand it. And to go in there and paint a picture like that is so important to be a storyteller as a CISO, more so than it used to be in the past.
So I got a question.
Sure.
Because I've never had to explain, how these conversations, I've never seen a conversation like what you guys are describing happen where a security professional goes into a boardroom and they plead their case. And the choice is you get really good at storytelling, right? You can't lose them in the technical aspects of, bytes and feeds and speeds, right? You can't do that. So I'm curious, what's one of the most effective ways of telling the story to get the executive teams to understand security more so than approaching it technically, right? Because, like I said, I haven't seen it happen, but I'm curious, based on all of your experiences, maybe the things that are said, the type of story that was told, or maybe like a certain framework, because, you know, NIST is not a storytelling framework, right? But how do you apply concepts of storytelling in this conversation to get the point across so that you can get to the outcome that you're looking for? I think I'd find that interesting to hear, and I'm sure, you know, anyone listening would find that interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can take a stab at it. So for this board and previous boards, I have used the NIST cybersecurity framework to measure our maturity and say, like, this is our baseline risk assessment and this is how mature we are. And what are you going to do to actually improve the maturity? So it's more like, these are some projects that we have to increase the maturity over the next quarter in these specific domains. And then these are the projects that we've completed and what the impact has been on the maturity. But I think, and there's not always opportunity, but sometimes there are. If you could take it, you know, a lot of executives are reading the Wall Street Journal or other articles. So if you can kind of translate those stories to real things that are happening in the industry, that would be helpful. Like one example might be when CDK, which is a very large dealer management software that impacted all of the dealerships, right? Like, leveraging that to articulate to the board, like, this is what happened. Like, yes, we weren't impacted, but here's the controls that we have in place to prevent this from happening to us. As one example is, I found pretty effective using like headlines almost.
And also, you know, you're just so you mentioned plead your case, right, Fern? But I think it's a little bit more of a misnomer, because you are a line item in an agenda on a docket for the board. You know, before you is the CFO, before that's the general counsel, after you is the CIO, and so on. So you're just a 15 to 30-minute line item in a quarterly board meeting. And so you are there to give them a board update on cybersecurity. So you're there to update them. Now, what they want to hear, how are we doing? What's our risk? Anything new on the incident front, privacy front, et cetera? And what do you need from a financial standpoint, and what are you going to do with it? So you have to be very quick, very articulate, and you have to be able to speak that in a way that resonates to the non-technical board member, all the way to the person on your board who may have worked for a large implementer and is a very good technology. So you have to make sure your message resonates with everybody around the table, and you're just presenting, this is our metrics, this is our next projects that we're going to be working on. Here's 10 global news items that you may be interested in that are either similar to our industry or may impact us, and here's how we were protected against those type of threats. And they just want to get a good warm and fuzzy feeling when they leave that room that you know what you're doing, you have a good program, that you're well funded, and you have what you need. And then really the arguments are with your leadership. Like my bosses, the CIO and the CFO, that's where the real plead your case kind of comes into play. Right?
Yeah, for a lot of large organizations, there are subcommittees, right? So you may have an audit committee that then reports to the board, right? So you may participate in that. You may even have these days an AI committee that's trying to figure out how AI is being used or how we should implement AI within the organization. So there will be these committees that you may be part of as a security leader or an IT leader that then report into the board. So there's more communications than just that short time for the board meeting that Troy's talking about.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. So it's kind of like the board meetings are more so make sure that anything bad is brought to the top, but then also everything good is mentioned as well. And then more so the negotiation and the budget and kind of the pleading your story happens internally without the board there, right? The CFO and the CIO. Okay. So, but I do like the fact that you said you take, so for you specifically, like this was the dealership, right? It's very, we'll say, adjacent to the people that are in this room, right? So I think part of that too is when people are presenting or talking, they have to find situations that are close to home, but not at home, right? And it's like, if you can find a story that's close enough to home, but not affecting your home, then it makes it more, as they say, hits close to home, right? And when people look at their business or the businesses that they run, right, or the ones that they're a part of, and they see someone else that has fallen, it kind of goes back into the phrase of, learn from someone else's mistakes. So what's interesting about that is you can easily pull inspiration from people that have essentially kind of fallen on the sword close enough to home to present that as a way to say, look, if we don't do these things, we might be in a similar situation. And because it's so close, but it's not close enough, it hasn't impacted you, but it's enough to kind of get people to maybe stand up and do some things, right? So I really like that. I hadn't even thought about that, but again, I haven't presented before. So, but I do like that story.
Yeah, it's like if there's a big breach at Coca-Cola, it sure gives the Pepsi CISO, ammunition to go in and ask for more budget to solve that problem.
Yeah, but it's not even just Pepsi, right? I think everybody, we should all be looking at what happened in that incident and break it down to see, does that impact our own organizations? I like to break those down with my team to say, here's what happened in this case. Here are the controls that we have, or here's where we need to tweak our security layers so that we can address a similar incident happening here. So you don't have to wait for those leadership meetings and the executive meetings. You should be doing those within your teams. And if you're a security analyst or engineer listening to this today, that's a good exercise to do. Go take a look at some of the news items, what's happening, how are some of these security incidents occurring, and try to solution a response to that. I would love for my analyst to come back into me and say, hey, over the weekend, I was just looking at this article. I saw that they got an incident based off of these lack of controls. Here's some things I'd like for us to implement. I mean, think about that. If you had an analyst came into your office and said that, right away, you would think this person's a rock star, right?
Yeah, and that's one thing, Damien, I was talking about for the board. We had to do that top 10 list. It was a spreadsheet of, what the attack was, who it affected, but then it was what were the TTPs of the attack and how were we protected against those TTPs? So that's very important information that your CISO wants to know. So if you're an engineer, as Damien mentioned, it's great to get ahead of that and say, how would we have handled that if it happened to us?
That's good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's like gold. That might be one of the best golden nuggets we've gotten on this episode is for people that are in cybersecurity, because we talk a lot about getting in, right? But once you're in, how do you make the most of your time there, right? And I think Damien's example of an analyst going through and finding recent events, current events, and looking at kind of what happened, the cause and the effect, and then applying that into the business that they're working for and taking that to leadership. Now, I don't know about you guys or ladies, but if it was me and I had someone that showed up and did that for me, instant raise, or at least top of the list when it comes to being on the docket for the next leadership role or the next.
It definitely, shows readiness for leadership, right? Because maybe it's obvious to us to do that, but maybe not so much to our team members to do it. But even if you're trying to drive an initiative, I don't know, like you have publicly exposed S3 buckets as an example, and you're still trying to get somebody to make them private as one example. You still need to articulate why, and so you could translate that back to like the Capital One breach, and so it's just like trying to Troy's point, like telling the story depending on what narrative and what issue you're trying to address.
Yeah, but by bringing those in, one thing is for certain is that it shows not necessarily leadership, but it shows the desire to make improvements, right? And whereas a lot of people might not actually be proactive in their approach, and they might just come in, do what they need to do, go home, 9 to 5 type of mentality. But the one person that shows up and says, hey, I did this research, this is what I found, this is how we're very similar, we could be in a similar situation. The reality is not everyone in security, in leadership of security, is aware of everything happening in the trenches, right? And there might be some small oversights. And if that one person were to show up with a problem that no one was aware of and to potentially save, an incident from happening, like instant raise. So that's why I said it was probably definitely like a gold nugget from Damien.
I want to just touch on something you mentioned here because it's near and dear to my heart. Is you mentioned like instant raise, right? I want folks listening to know that, there's a lot of times where leaders like Dina, myself, Damien, we want to give our team raises. They deserve it. We stack rank and we know that we have rock stars that really deserve and actually need a raise, like they're underpaid for the industry benchmarks. But our businesses are holding us back. There were several people in my lifetime that I would give a raise today if I had that authority to do so, but we're handcuffed by the financials and the business. And sometimes raises and payroll is outside the cybersecurity budget, or it's handled differently because it's a personnel issue. And so I want people to understand that, sometimes your boss really sees your work, recognizes you, and wants to give you a raise, but just can't because of the bureaucratic nightmare that is budgets and people. So back over to Damien, but I just want people to understand that
that's a completely different topic, but I mean that's completely true, right? It's kind of scary that in order for you to go get a big raise, you have to leave your current organization and find a new job that's going to pay you a lot more money. And obviously, we don't want to lose the rock stars, but those are the first ones to leave. I'll tell you this: if I have a real high performer in my team and they find a really good job outside of my organization, full support to them, right? I feel great that we had taken somebody and grown them to that particular level in their career where they can move on and get a really good job. But I would say this about the being proactive in trying to become that type of analyst or engineer. I tell our interns, so right from the very beginning when the interns come in, or new in career, people just graduating, starting their careers, to be proactive. We're not going to be giving you exact details of tasks that need to be done, because if I can script it out and I can automate it, I probably don't need the analyst to do it. And so we already start the analyst at the level where, if you see something that can be automated, go ahead and automate it, right? You don't have to ask for permission. If you see something that needs improvement, go ahead and improve it. Obviously go through the proper documentation and change control, but we're fully enabling our analysts, and especially the entry-level ones, to make those decisions. And I think if you build that culture, when they get into that middle level, 3 to 5 years, they start to be more proactive and start to look at these news articles and then come back to you and say, hey, I think we should do X, Y, and Z so that we can improve our security posture. And so I would tell anyone listening that if you're starting your career or you're in that entry to mid-level, to be proactive. Don't just take tasks and do those tasks, because eventually, if that's all you're doing, they're going to be taken over by AI. So you have to move up the stack and be a little bit more proactive.
Yeah, that's fair, Damien. I think you're touching on most leaders in cybersecurity. Like, we don't have the time and bandwidth to micromanage our team, so we're empowering them to find and fix problems. And I can say our team is very proactive, and I don't need to ask them to do something. They just go and build it, right? They have the skill set to go do it. And as long as they're opening the right change and communicating the changes to the appropriate business stakeholders, I support them. And if something goes wrong, I take accountability as their leader. But, fail fast, take risk.
So that kind of leads us directly into the next topic, because the next topic was more about hunting and finding that there are a lot of issues, right? So the next topic specifically talks about how there is a large number of widespread weakness in security, right? And what I find interesting about this is, to Damien's point about, making a priority to go out and find these things internally, I'm curious, how some of these organizations that have a lot of these we'll call them basic issues, are overlooked. So in a past episode, we talked about an incident that involved McDonald's with one of their HR systems, right? With a weak password being 1 through 6. So it's in every we'll say vertical of commercial business, that a lot of people are failing to do the basics. And to quote a friend, Ashley, where she had a presentation here locally at CactusCon, where she said a lot of people worry about the shiny objects, but in her mind, you have to get back to the basics. And I've heard that so many times. It's back to the basics. You have to secure everything of the business in the most fundamental way, and then from there stack on. So I think of it as like building a house. You have the most solid foundation possible, and then from there you can have a fancy house. But if you don't have a solid foundation, it ends up creeping its way into issues down the line, right? So in security, for all of you, this is more so, maybe my first question is, how do you get back to the basics to make sure that some of the most basic issues, vulnerabilities, aren't an issue? Because it's one thing for someone to do an advanced attack and get in through a way that is like 1 in a million. But to find out that your basic password was 1 through 6 and they got privileged access to some of the most critical systems in your infrastructure because of a simple issue, like to me, that seems like people lose their jobs over that versus a very advanced attack through, like, we'll say, like a nation state, right?
Yeah, so that's probably the largest percentage of attacks, honestly, Fern, is the common misconfigurations or just the laziness in that matter. And I'll say, just in past penetration tests at every business that I've been at for the last 20 years, there have always been findings of very foundational common sense problems. Default passwords on printers, servers, computers, you name it. Open SMTP servers, relays, where you can just relay email out or in to people and bypass all your systems. There's just been so many just common, should be known problems that employees missed. So to your point, like we're spending tons of money, millions of dollars on new fancy AI equipment. We're not even changing the default password on the printer so they can, grab the LDAP and turn it around and get an identity and use it against us. So these massive attacks we're hearing, these big breaches, they're not normally a sophisticated 0-day exploit. They're usually just the default printer password, and then they're grabbing an LDAP identity and going from there. So
yeah, Fern, you mentioned this earlier in another episode, right? It's like the door is left open, so the criminals just have to walk right through. I would say so getting back to the basics, what about assets? Do you guys even know where your assets are? And I'm not talking just physical assets, but data, right? So I think we've been talking about this recently. Where are your assets? So maybe you don't know that there's a printer out there. Maybe you don't know that there's a laptop out there. It's not in your inventory. Or you don't know that data is sitting in some cloud repository that you just had no idea existed because somebody spun up an S3 bucket on their personal credit card. So those are the basics, right? Just trying to figure that stuff out so you can protect it.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. And what I've done is I call it like a periodic table. I actually have something that I can share and link it in the show notes. But it's like there's all these different attack vectors, and the concept of the network obviously has changed with remote work. But what controls do you have on your endpoint? What controls do you have for data? And then what's your coverage like? And so I'm using like operational metrics to kind of say, from an adversary perspective, what vulnerabilities are on our perimeter or our edge, and then kind of giving ourselves a report card, and then inside out, like the reverse. And so that's been effective to Damien's point, identifying maybe shadow IT or misconfiguration that you didn't actually know about.
That sounds pretty cool. A periodic table?
Well, yeah, it sounds fancy. I'll link it in the show notes if you want to. But yeah, it's been helpful to me to show even like underwriters or the executive team, like, why have we invested in this and what controls do we have in place to mitigate some of these, for lack of a better word, like low level or unsophisticated attack vectors.
Okay.
Unsophisticated, that's the key, right? So we need to get back into just the basics, like you said, and Ashley said in her presentation, get back to the basics. And so back to the very first topic of this episode, talking about budget. Well, the question is always like, do I really need to spend more money if I don't have my basics covered? Or if that money is going to solidify that core layer of security, then yeah, for sure. go and spend it.
And Fern, you were mentioning earlier about the Coast Guard. You start thinking about critical infrastructure. There are 16 domains in critical infrastructure, and if you're a member of the FBI's InfraGuard, which is the local public-private partnership all over the nation, every city has one. Every major city has an FBI InfraGuard where they share, data between the federal government and private sector to try to beef up our critical infrastructure protections. We're talking things like telecom, water, power, nuclear, all the things that you may not think of. These are, in some cases, antiquated systems, very old technology. We're talking about trying to modernize the whole federal infrastructure, water, hydroelectric plants, all this stuff is susceptible to the threat actors. So sometimes when they're doing these threat hunts, they're finding, huge gaps. And when you're talking about allowing threat actors to take over a water treatment facility, as an example, that has a lot more public health implications than just taking down a server that hosts data, right?
Yeah. So interesting story is I met a gentleman that has his own business that works specifically in this environment. And one of the things that he was telling me was how it is so antiquated, specifically in this instance in the power industry, that if you're not on site plugging into a device, there's no way to get to it. Because of, he was talking about using like a DB9 serial port, right, to even log into the system. And it's like he has to do a lot of travel because of some of these infrastructure that he's, kind of using to do work with. If he's not physically there, he can't actually do anything.
Well, that makes me feel better, honestly. I'd rather him have to plug in physically than to be able to access it from Oklahoma. You don't want that, because then somebody from Iran or North Korea or China can get in from.
They better have good physical security in that case, right?
Yeah. He got to have the physical. But he also, that's exactly what he said, Troy. He said that it makes it more secure in a small aspect because someone remote can't get in. But it also makes it very painful for anyone that's working on it because they have to be there physically.
Well, the downside to that too is that you cannot monitor it in real time unless you're plugged into it. So how do you know somebody hasn't plugged in at a weak access point, right? Yeah. Physical access point where they're in there? You have no idea unless you go to that, and it may take you weeks to get to that site and plug in, and then realize, oh, somebody's already plugged in and maybe connected the network that you didn't intend. So you have no idea because you're not monitoring it remotely.
That's true, because if you have to be there to have eyes on it, on your screen, that means there's really no way to see it outside of being there, right? And if you don't see someone, they could be in there for months before you even realize that they've done anything, right? But that's, like Troy said, critical infrastructure, you said 16 categories of critical infrastructure. That's a lot of different areas for people to make improvements, but based on what this article is saying is weak credentials, poor segmentation, and a lack of logging. So those are the main ones that came up in this specific article, but weak credentials, segmentation, and logging seem to be pretty basic to me.
Yeah, but if you look at the breach reports that are put out every year, right, isn't like compromise or weak credentials generally like number one?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So interesting question then is weak credentials is a result of the policy in place for those credentials, right? Because I'm going to put on my average Fern cap here. If I need to log into something on whatever, and it says, oh, you have to have at least 12 characters, one capital, at least a number, and a special character. By default, I cannot enter 1 through 6, right? That's not an option for me. So maybe a little bit of devil's advocate, is it on the security teams to implement credential requirements in all of those organizations? Or is it okay if they just let people pick whatever they want? Because to me, it seems like the answer should be the security team should set foundational things, like back to the basics, set certain things in place where passwords have certain character limits or minimums and other qualities of the password. But like you said, and the number one thing is weak credentials. So Is it weak credentials, or is it the security team is not enforcing?
We talked about this in previous episodes. It's not just the password. I mean, there's technologies out there for passwordless. So do you really need a password if you have certificates in MFA and a bunch of other layers that you can put on top? So somebody could have your password, but if they're not logging in from the specific device that has that certificate, they're not getting in. And if you layer on top the MFA, well, if somebody has your laptop or your device and they don't have your secondary token, maybe a biometric, they're still not getting in. And so it's always security layers.
And we're talking about weak passwords for people. Like Windows is usually pretty easy to configure for stronger passwords, but routers, switches, firewalls, backup systems, NAS, all that stuff are generally up to the administrator to set those passwords, and the security team has zero visibility into setting requirements. They can be set by policy, but they can't be, looked at from a technological perspective. And then, the administrator can set it to, whatever he wants, blue sky 1, which is stupid, but it could happen. And, they can be hacked pretty easily. So weak passwords generally doesn't mean user passwords. It usually means infrastructure passwords.
Yeah. I mean, what about service accounts, right? So non-human identities, NHIs, have been kind of a huge topic this year. And maybe we do a full episode on just identity, right? I think
I would love that. Yes.
Yeah, that's a big topic. It's not just the human password anymore.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that more recently around NHI. And I know some people that work at companies that are kind of doing that, right? And that was actually my next question to Troy, but maybe we'll just save it for another episode, because to me, that seems like the whole new frontier, right?
Interestingly, Fern, is that where I saw a lot of weak passwords, you're going to love this, is the APC backups, the power battery backups in the rack of the data center. The pen testers come in, they look around, they find like the default passwords on these power backups, and people are like, oh, well, that's not important. Yes, it's important, because people can log into that with the default password and hit shut down, and there goes your entire server rack, which could be servers, backup, and everything else. So it's so funny to me that those are always the key victims of weak passwords in my mind.
Yeah, I never even thought about that, but you're right. Like, the minute the power goes down to the rack, if you shut down both sides, like the A and B side on the power, like the entire rack is gone, just up in smoke. Interesting. So, but I like that, because in my mind, a weak password is just a user password, but like Troy said, it's more so on devices. And
yeah, well, I think it's fairly complex, right? Because some users might be storing their credentials in a browser, and then they might be infected with like an info stealing malware, as an example, which we've seen quite a bit of. And so,
good point.
Yeah, want to be careful there.
So no storing passwords in browsers.
I don't recommend it, but
Yeah, we talked about this.
maybe my colleagues have different
Yeah, we talked
perspectives.
about this.
I agree 100%.
I can't remember which episode, but we did talk about that browser vault being compromised.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think my question at the time was, I don't remember what my question was, but it was something funny, something an average person might ask. Was, why do I care? So some of the most important things from today's episode that I like the most is, if you're in security and you're in maybe an entry level role, to go above and beyond. Maybe look at some of the current events that are happening in adjacent or even the same industry, and find a way to relate that and the risk from those to your environment, and take that to leadership, because there might be something that people aren't aware of. Never store your password in the browser. Make sure you have strong passwords on the user side, but more so importantly on the devices, right?
Yeah, and I would say that Troy's comment around storytelling too. Mm-hmm. If you suck at storytelling, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm. You're just done. So
yeah.
Yeah, you might as well just find another job.
So we talked about how many times we talked about, we have to be internal salespeople, because we got to sell our program. We got to be able to sell, the accomplishments and the growth of our organizations. Yeah. So yeah, you got to turn around and sell it. You can't sell it, you're not going to be successful at this level.
So here is my something I've been thinking about recently, and something that I don't know if I've shared it with any of you, but I think security leaders might just be some of the best salespeople in the world. And I'm going to tell you why. because they're essentially selling the fact that an organization needs to spend millions of dollars on something that they cannot see, they cannot touch, they cannot understand. In a lot of cases, they don't understand the security part of it. They can only expect to have certain outcomes, or on the other side, not have certain issues. And to be able to get someone to release the purse strings for millions of dollars on something that they can't tangibly see has got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. Because you think most people will buy something that they can take with them, but you're essentially selling something that they can't actually do that with. So that's my closing thought is all of you may not have realized it, but each of you are some of the best salespeople in the world because you have been able to get people to separate themselves from millions of dollars with the intent of securing the business.
Is that why some of us get to eat popcorn at the Super Bowl?
Yeah.
That's a joke, by the way, for those of you guys that haven't watched the previous episode.
For that reason.
But we should wrap right here.
Yeah. If you don't understand the popcorn at the Super Bowl reference,
Watch Man Ride's episode.
check out 2 episodes
That's it.
prior. Any closing thoughts from, we usually go around the room. Damien, we'll go with you, thanks for that, and then we'll end with
It's a great episode. Thank you, Dina, for joining us. Always happy to see you, and glad you could be a guest on this episode.
Yeah, same for me. Thanks, Dina, for joining. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun. And I think there are nuggets of gold in this episode. So give it a listen.
Well, if you made it this far, hopefully you're good.
Listen again.
Yeah, listen again. Listen twice. And I guess with that, we're out. We'll see you next Monday for the next episode of the DTF Cyber Podcast. Thanks for listening.